Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'd like to welcome you to our third episode in the four-part seminar series that addresses the concept of the MetaWest and examines this larger cities system and its capabilities. Today, the discussion is going to focus on geoeconomics, and we have with us today Mark Duckenfield, who's the chairman of the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Our moderator today is Ron Granieri, Dr. Ron Granieri, whom many of you know, who is our FPRI Templeton Education Fellow and the Executive Director of FPRI Center for the Study of America and the West. And he's also an Associate Professor of History in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. And because both Ron and Dr. Duckenfield are employees of the U.S. Army War College, I am compelled to do our typical disclaimer, which is that their views are their own personal views and do not represent the U.S. Army, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. I would also, before we get started, like to thank you once again, those of you who are members, sponsors, members of our board. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your generous support. If you're not in one of those categories, I'd also like to appeal to you to support us. We can't do this without your support. It's vital, and we appreciate it, and keep it coming. And if you're not yet in one of those categories, please consider supporting us. We will be taking questions as usual, so please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be going to those questions about midway through, although I think Ron sometimes dips into them even a little sooner. So go ahead and start putting them in right away. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron Granieri.
Thank you, Raleigh. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this FPRI seminar on the MetaWest as a geoeconomic system. I am Ron Granieri, and I join my colleagues at FPRI in thanking you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. As part of FPRI's Robert Strauss Who Pay project, the Atlantic System in a World of Great Power Rivalry, we at FPRI have organized this series of discussions. This is the third of four, as President Flynn just told you, to discuss aspects of what we call the MetaWest. That is the network of organizations that link the democratic states of the Atlantic system, what people would think of as the Cold War West, to global allies and partners outside of the Atlantic system, to think about how they relate to each other, how they coordinate with each other, how they should harmonize policies or can harmonize policies with each other. A guiding idea of these conversations is the understanding that the MetaWest exists as a thing, even if its leaders and populations do not always clearly articulate or formally acknowledge it. Adversaries and critics certainly recognize connections between, say, the EU and the G7, or NATO for that matter. But how well does that coordination work? How well should it work? How should it function, especially in a much more globally competitive environment? So how does the MetaWest operate as a geoeconomic system? Would it better serve the interests of the free states of this community to speak more clearly about their connections? And if so, how should those organizations and their leaders behave to make those relationships more effective? These questions and yours will guide us in conversation this afternoon with our guest, Dr. Mark Duckenfield. Professor Mark Duckenfield is Professor of International Economics at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, and he was chair of the department from 2015 to 2021, which means, of course, he was my boss, but he's not my boss anymore. So, I warn him that he can't expect over too much deference. But he previously, before he came to the U.S. Army War College, he taught at the U.S. Air War College, the London School of Economics, and University College London. A graduate of Swarthmore and Harvard, he is the author of Business and the Euro, from Palgrave in 2006, as well as editor and author of numerous works on gold, financial crises, and the economics of national security. Mark, it's delightful to have you with us on this for this conversation. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks a lot, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here.
You bet. So I want to start, when we think about the economic architecture of the post-war world, which may or may not be coming to an end as we sit here. It started very much within the Atlantic system. And so how did European integration, a subject that you and I both are very interested in, how did that fit into the American vision for the post-war economic order?
Well, the European integration for the Americans and for the Europeans starts off in large measure as a peace project. Europe had been the centerpiece of two great world wars, killing 20 million in the first and many times that in the second. And this had destabilized and wrecked the international economy and the international political system. So a central feature of the post-war environment, post-World War II, was to try and create a system that could keep these fractious European countries from fighting each other yet again, having a re-rise of nationalism or other conflict that would again destroy economies, destroy people, and create lots of problems. Now, the results of the Second World War, in part, in addition to the devastation, also left Europe prostrate. That the Soviet Union occupied half of Europe, the United States occupied the other half, and these were two contrasting values and ideological systems. One, a democratic capitalist one with a welfare state, personified by the United States or exemplified, and the other, a state socialist system that the Soviet Union was the model for. And keep in mind, in 1945, both of these systems were triumphalist. The Soviet Union had stopped, and the Red Army in particular, had stopped the Nazis and had thrown them back and taken Berlin. And the United States, with its great industrial potential, had contributed to the defeat of both Germany and Japan. So both of these superpowers became the real dividers of Europe. But for the Americans, looking to try to bring together the disparate members of Europe, wanted to do so in a way that was collaborative and cooperative. Of course, the Soviet model was much more centralized, where communist parties dominated local governments and largely took their orders from Moscow. But in the West, the United States wanted to engineer a system that, while the United States might have a guiding hand, was one of which the Europeans were more collaborative with each other. So European integration, certainly from the American perspective, with Marshall Aid and other support through the World Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, was designed to come up with collaborative plans, starting with the European coal and steel community, coal and steel being essential military industries, to try and get collaboration across borders between major West European powers, particularly Germany and France, so that they would not come into conflict with each other. So that forms something of the genesis of intra-European cooperation. And of course, the generations in Europe saw the great failures and devastation of the war as something they didn't want to repeat either. So for them too, Europe was a peace policy, but also an economic policy, one that could provide for joint prosperity and rebuilding to avoid the economic ravages of the Great Depression that had preceded the Second World War, the political destabilization of that era, and also to solidify a democratic basis. So the three elements of security, one that was in part bolstered by the United States and the NATO alliance, as you've discussed in your previous sessions, the economic element of European integration and cooperation on economic matters, and political democracy, all formed a basis for what I think was the start of, I'll call it an American system, although it's in Europe, but one of which there's local rule, but also cooperation and collaboration within Europe and internationally.
Right. This is a question that I think so gets at, we're going to talk about how this fits more broadly, but I'm curious about this vision, sort of once this process of collaboration, cooperation, and the systems are set up in the post-war world. Is it fair to say that there was no expiration date for these organizations? But if there isn't, how what happens once Europe has recovered, I guess, is both a political and economic question, right? How does the relationship between the United States and its European partners change over time?
Yeah, and this is what you see in the first really quarter century after the war. The United States, its infrastructure and industry are intact. Europe is still rebuilding and regenerating. But of course, Europe wasn't rebuilding and regenerating into an area that they didn't know anything about. They'd previously been industrialized, many had been democracies, so they were rebuilding into a fashion that was familiar to them. And you're right, there's no expiration date. And some of the proponents of European integration say, well, it's European integration is like a bicycle. You just got to keep pedaling on it or it's going to fall over. So the whole point of it is there's no expiration date, and you're just moving steadily forward, meeting the next challenges in a cooperative and collaborative way, with the idea that integration and cooperation is the preferable way to resolve your differences. Now, over the 25 years after 1945, European economies reestablish themselves. They start competing on international markets. The Germans in particular are particularly good at this. And the American share of world GDP, exports, and so on begins to erode, as it naturally would when you don't have any competitors. It's very easy to be competitive in everything. I mean, one study in the late 1940s had the United States as the most efficient producer of every industry except bicycles. For some reason, the Italians were the best producers of bicycles. But of course, by the 1960s and 70s, the United States had ceded those positions to other countries that had skills, talents, lower labor costs, more efficient production. And the Americans were running trade deficits for the first time since really the end of the 19th century. And you had an erosion of the American economic position. Now we sort of think about that now in terms of, the tide is going out on the United States, whatever. But really, the U.S. economic position internationally in 2021 is pretty much identical to where it was in 1971. The big erosion occurred in the previous quarter century, not in the last half century. If anything, in the last half century, it's Europe that has seen the erosion of its position rather than the United States. So the West might have been losing out, but the United States is pretty much exactly where it was the day I was born. So.
Well, there you go. That's very satisfying all the way around, right?
Very stand pat. Yeah.
Well, but that's actually the larger point that you're making is very good for pushing this discussion forward, right? So a certain degree of rebalancing was a feature, right, not a bug in this system, right? The Americans were making the assumption that Europe would recover, but it would recover within a system whereby prosperity would lead to shared stability and would lead to good things for everybody. What about the relationship of this this community, this Atlantic community, to other partners, right? We think specifically about the Japanese, but also later on with further developments in places like Taiwan, like South Korea. Are those relationships, initially, are they bilateral relationships between the United States and each of these states, or how, if at all, are they drawn into this, to any kind of larger American system?
Yes, that's right. So the United States has you have a sort of gradual expansion of the leadership or governorship of the Atlantic system, as you've been calling it up until 1971, sort of culminates with the G7. That while the United States had initially been the leader and still remains the leader within the G7, it began a period where it would start doing so in collaboration with other countries. And so the feature that you speak of is that as other countries recover, they could take more of their share of the leadership of the club. And so the G7 in the 1970s becomes essentially a group of very similar countries. They're largely democratic, they're capitalist, and they have very high per capita incomes, and that's an important point. And this then includes Japan, which by this point is the second largest economy in the world, surpassing the Federal Republic in the late 60s. So you have that. There's also a promise made to the developing world that we often don't discuss, that the trading and finance and development relationships through the IMF, the World Bank, and what was then the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, but in the 1990s becomes the World Trade Organization, that developing countries would benefit the most from this system. They would converge with those of what were seen as the advanced industrial countries. They would modernize, they'd develop, and they would come to look more like Western Europe and the United States. So again, the promise was, and of course there were disputes about whether or not this was in fact the reality, but the promise was, you take part in this system, you will grow economically as well. In fact, because the transfers of money and capital will be matter more to you because you're poor, you will grow faster, have faster rates of growth, and it'll be even more beneficial. So in a sense, what we're experiencing now in the rise of the developed world is exactly the promise that we hung our hats on in the 60s and 70s for the developing world. It should not be a surprise. This is in fact what we promised the policy would be. It wasn't that the United States and the wealthiest countries of the world would remain disproportionately wealthy with such a great gap between the developed world. It's that everyone would develop and continue to grow economically.
Well, and that gets to a complicated question, right? I mean, I'm glad we're using the terminology that was very common in the 60s and 70s and has been ever since, where we talk about modernization, development, progress, right? These are all, we're back to the bicycle metaphor, right? The idea is you're going forward, and it's sort of going forward. And yet, there are two questions that come to mind about this, and I'll pose them both, and we can attack them separately. One is, are these developments, should these developments be considered sort of developments in market, in the ineluctable rationality of the market? So in other words, is this just capitalism developing? Or, and then the related question is, what role does any kind of ideas or values about democracy, about the proper forms of development, about the competition between this Western capitalist model and other forms of development? Like what role do ideas play in this, or is this really just, this is the triumph of the market, capital T, capital M?
Well, I mean, there's an element of it that is very, it's very mirror imaging, that we look at ourselves and see ourselves as the top of the heap. Everyone else should come to be like this, and it's a linear path of development. And you can see why this might chafe for people who you're suggesting this to. It's this suggestion that people in the rest of the world are just, they're just Americans who didn't get on the boat. That's just what, everyone is in Africa or South Asia or Eastern Europe or whatever. And I think that's a mistake. I mean, as you said, there are different values and different ideas and conceptions about the most appropriate relation between people, between men and women, children and parents, different religious groups, the state and the individual, landowners and tenants. All of these things are tied up in cultural relationships, some of which are quite long-standing. So you should not be surprised. You see them in the United States, that people are still hearkening back to, the steel towns or the coal towns, even as those jobs have migrated away. So any sort of social change of which capitalism provides a huge element of it is going to get some pushback for people who don't find change particularly welcome. The urbanization or suburbanization of society, the depopulation of rural areas, all of these put tensions on traditional relationships. You see it even in the United States, the urban-rural divide we talk about, and what might have been a fairly, politically acceptable solution in the US Senate now suddenly gets manifested as having stark partisan differences that are difficult to surmount. And other countries have different versions of this as well. The United States is not unique to that. So that's one factor. But how much is the sort of the forces of capitalism or the exposure to international market forces, how much does that matter? And I think it matters a great deal. In fact, there are always local nuances. German capitalism, I mean, you're a scholar of Konrad Adenauer, German Christian democracy and the sort of corporatized capitalism that exists in Germany compared to social democratic capitalism in Sweden is rather different than American capitalism.
True.
So while they're capitalist and the market distributes the majority of the products, there are differences in how the Germans might prioritize an insurance type model for various forms of social care linked via major employers and unions. And it might be much more state-centric in the Nordic countries and maybe more market-oriented in the United States with more debates about where the proper role of government is. Mm-hmm. So you have that, but those debates or even different structures might come in different countries and how they ameliorate them. And you can see some of the legacies in the United States. In the United States, Social Security beneficiaries, the lower paid spouse, even if they don't work at all in their lifetime, is entitled to a Social Security benefit of half of what their spouse gets. Now, this was a legacy of when women were not mainly in the workforce, and a husband would be the primary wage earner. But if the husband died, you don't want to leave the widow destitute. So we set up a system that had embedded within it that sort of concept of a social relationship. And other countries will have similar arrangements for a variety of things based upon people's relationships at work and elsewhere. But the market does put a lot of pressure onto these, and particularly in more what we'll call traditional societies, where people are living the way they've probably lived for 1,000 years. And as they've opened up to the market, all of a sudden, things that had been done more communally or without much outside intervention suddenly start being opened to that. People who engaged in some occupations, maybe if you're growing corn or whatever, and you generally supplied that to the local market, it might be cheaper all of a sudden to import corn from somewhere else. You've done nothing wrong. You're working just as hard as your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents worked, but all of a sudden, you can't sell corn anymore, and you become destitute and move. So the market can be a very turbulent force in that regard, and opening up and fracturing long-standing relationships between people, and people often don't like that and get frustrated.
True, but all that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned, right? I believe I read that somewhere.
Yeah, so we're compelled to face the real conditions of life.
Well, and this then gets into the question, in the context of these seminars talking about the idea of the MetaWest, the idea that there is a community. It's very common, and even people who talk about clashes of civilizations, like Sam Huntington, right? They assume there is a connection between, say, the United States and Western Europe, and they call it the West. We can talk about how accurate that is, because you've already noted there are variations within the West and types, even between capitalist states, about types of capitalism, as there's differences in types of democracies. But what is the relationship between this, if we think of this Atlantic core of democratic capitalism after 1945, and the capitalism that develops in other states, in other parts of the world, in the developing world, but also in East Asia? How should we think about the, are the differences so great that this is a completely different community, or are the differences between, say, Japan and Western Europe, South Korea and Western Europe, South Korea and the United States, are the differences just like the nuances we note between, say, Germany and Sweden, or between France and Italy?
Well, you certainly have some nationalistic differences, the senses of national grievance or national rivalry, particularly between, say, like Korea and Japan, for instance, or China and Japan, certainly exists. I would say the big difference, to the extent we're trying to create a concept of the MetaWest, it's I think democracy is probably, I mean, capitalism and an American security umbrella are part of it, but I think the real crucial thing for membership and participation is democracy, the rule of law, even-handed participation in international international organizations, not repudiation of them or a cynical misuse of them. I think that's the crucial feature, because then it becomes much rarer, because the People's Republic has high elements of capitalism and market-based competition. It's integrated with lots of these international organizations. But when we talk about the MetaWest, we would not include, I don't think, the People's Republic of China. So what differentiates the People's Republic from elsewhere? And then you can start seeing why it might differentiate from Korea or Japan. I do find, I mean, I'm not particularly comfortable with the phrase the MetaWest. I think it's got this, more than a whiff, or perhaps you would say a stench of post-imperialism to it. Certainly this would be the complaint that the Chinese would make, the People's Republic would make about it, as they do about a number of sort of universalistic declarations on human rights or what have you, that these are really Western values that we're attempting to, paper over and push onto other people. They're really European values, that they are not really compatible or otherwise useful in the Chinese setting at the very least, or for other countries. And it's just an attempt to impose an outside worldview onto other countries. I think that's I think that's an overstatement, but you can see how this could have some saliency. And they can often, the Chinese can often point to things as unsurprising. Is it surprising that the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom have suddenly come up with this new arrangement? This would not have surprised people 120 years ago. It's the alliance of the English-speaking peoples, or the Anglo-Saxons, or whatever you wanted to cast it as. So there are those elements as well. But I think the crucial distinction is democracy, and you see that being prevalent in a lot more places than simply the expansion of a sort of zone of the sort of American security protectorates, these American alliances and network of bases. It's democracy. It's it's sort of like the difference between cricket and soccer, or world football. That world football is probably universalistically appealing because it doesn't matter. People pick it up everywhere and like it. But cricket and baseball only appear where the British were imperialists or the Americans were dominant. So there's a sort of cultural push there. Whereas if you've just given competition to your own devices, soccer prevails. And democracy strikes me as being like that it tends to emerge and prevail even in environments where you don't necessarily have that external imposition. Although external imposition is it can be helpful, but it's not essential.
I'm reminded, a slight tangent, is in 1970 when Henry Kissinger was trying to warn President Nixon about the dangers of things going on in Cuba, as they noted that there were soccer fields being built around a base near Cienfuegos. And Kissinger says with great solemnity, Europeans play soccer, Cubans play baseball. So this was proof that the Soviets
Fidel Castro was a baseball player.
Indeed, Castro himself was a baseball player.
Yeah.
If the Cubs had only picked up his option, who knows what would have happened differently. but what you've raised is a crucial point, because we talk about, right, the idea of a kind of a broader West, the trilateralist vision of the 70s, which was to bring the Japanese and eventually the South Koreans and the Taiwanese, to bring them into a kind of bring them into the same community that existed in the Atlantic, and that they would be combined, they would be linked together through this mixture of democracy and capitalism. The rise of the People's Republic of China, clearly connected to capitalism, even if the Chinese don't like calling it that all the time. But what happens when there is a successful capitalist model that is not connected to democracy? Right? Will we discover that this linkage between capitalism and democracy was a lot more fragile than we imagined? And does that pose, how should a broader global community that's built around assuming that these two things go together, however you define capitalism, however you define democracy, that if it turns out that, you can make a whole lot of money by embracing this more authoritarian version of democracy. What does that mean for the future? I mean, because I think about this as well, as if the Chinese use the argument that we in Asia have different values than those people wherever they come from. And so therefore, the combination of our common historical values and the fact that we can all make lots of money means we should be a community and we should have nothing to do with, or we should be in opposition to this, whatever those Westerners say they are. What do you think about the long-term challenge to any visions of a broader democratic capitalist community?
Well, I mean, I think that is, if anything, that's the big challenge we face now. We have the old ideological struggle between state socialism and democratic capitalism, and now it's between, I think, democratic capitalism and authoritarian capitalism. I mean, for a very long time, the American policy has been that, hey, you open up your markets, you'll get economic growth, eventually the middle class will emerge and they'll go, yay, we want democracy. Now, if I'm sitting in Beijing, I'd be thinking they're talking about regime change here. That's not a very, very pleasant thought, but it's not necessarily true, as you pointed out. The Chinese Communist Party is betting a lot that that's not true. That in fact you can have sort of turn Gorbachev on his head. You can have perestroika without glasnost. That you can get the economic development and growth, but you don't really have to loosen things up on the side of civil liberties. And there are some things to be said and suggest about that. Our old friend Sam Huntington, who you referred to in Clash of Civilizations, also made a name for himself with political order and changing societies, where he argued that countries in transition going through major social change, all of these groups get agitated and they want things from the government, and really what you need is order. You don't, Americans might like democracy and checks and balances, but really the problem for most countries is an absence of order, and markets work best when they're ordered, and so a good Pinochet style government is just what you need. You don't want those unions in the streets or students. He has a very good line that you and I can perhaps relate to working at a war college, because we hit the trifecta with this, that you've got, rambunctious colonels, rioting students, and malcontented academics. That's a modernizing society. And you need a firm hand if you want to develop and get yourself into a higher, otherwise you're just going to be fighting amongst yourself, disorderly, and you won't have economic growth. And the People's Republic, that's what it's all about. The hard hand of the state to keep people within their lane and guided development, disciplined by access to international markets, driven by mass productivity. And that's the route to the future. And it's an authoritarian route. And you don't need to let up on things or let there be democracy. And the people go along with it because their lives are a whole lot better now than they used to be. And why? Chinese Communist Party held things together in a way no one else did. That would be their argument. And that's the one that we have to meet and challenge, I think. That'll probably, I would expect, be a form of the big debate over the next generation. And the bloom is off the boom for the West since the 90s, really the heyday. We've had we've had the big financial crisis of 2009, and then we've had the COVID response, where even though things originated in China, it has dealt with it rather better. I mean, authoritarian governments are not good at telling people they have problems, but on the other hand, they can shut cities down and seal off, travel in ways that democratic societies cannot. And they will put that up as examples of how their governance system is better. You want to get people back into school and into the office. Well, you shut things down for X amount of time, and you've got your security services to do it, and then you can get back to business.
Well, and that raises the question of whether the future, how does the West, or whatever we want to call it, the community that the United States aspires to lead and be the avatar of, how does that community respond to the challenge, the Chinese challenge, without abandoning the values that it claims, that this community claims, make it different and special and better?
Well, I mean, one of the advantages of such a disparate system as what we have is its ability to generate alternative ideas and ideas in competition with each other. Not so great at pursuing sustainable long-term strategies, but on the other hand, if things start going awry, then you can replace your leadership, come up with different ideas, and try and gravitate in a different direction. And that which would not be an option for the People's Republic, or as it was for the Soviet Union. They could get on the wrong track in various areas, and it would be very difficult to remove themselves. It's not that we don't have our own inertias as well. The recent war in Afghanistan gives you an example of that. But we do tend to have elements for correction, certainly in the term of economic and social policy, that are, I think, more desirable than the authoritarian alternative.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I see Gregory Bloomquist has a question here. He says that he agrees with the rejection of the MetaWest, strongly endorses Huntington's notion of the West is characterized uniquely by freedom. What other civilization is, he asks. But order is not the key. If order is not the key to the West, that does make markets capitalism possible. So what might a truly Western economic order look like that is characterized by freedom? He likes your comment that would be alternate ideas, but I guess that's the question is if it's a system that's built on freedom, then the beauty of it is that the question is constantly open and debated rather than offering a solution. Does that work? I'll ask this question that he's not asking, but it lingers in the air. Is that going to work when people say, well, we just want an answer?
Yeah, well, you certainly have some risks of, populism, that, the man on the horseback will come, and that's what you need. People, they're that, sort of the degradation of democracies. That's a risk that you have. Hopefully your institutions and your populations are committed enough to freedom, but you have to wonder if it's so easily overthrown. Is it fundamental to your culture if you can overthrow these freedoms so easily? Or
right.
But the other part is that there's an element within the West. We talked about the variations on capitalism, the varieties of capitalism, and I think that's one of the benefits. Even within the United States, you see different variations within different states. So the ability to have both a federal domestic solution in bigger countries, or alternate national solutions that are more fitting with their own historical traditions and arrangements, I think is very helpful. And also that, to a certain extent, actually, that it embraces, I think, a element of what the Chinese say, and one I think that we acknowledge and recognize, of the uniqueness of people's individual cultures. It's not something that we reject. We should, we celebrate that, and being able to find ways to accommodate that, I think, are good, as long as it's one that's in, with fairness and equity towards people. You wouldn't want a system where your traditions were oppressive, or the Jim Crow legacy comes to mind. I mean, that your traditions of racial oppression seems to not be really in line with the idea of the West as a place of freedom, for instance.
Right. For example.
Yeah.
Well, and let me circle back to an economic question also that fits in with this, and is how much of the post 1945 international system has been built around the idea of the dollar as reserve currency. And certainly the fact that the dollar is a reserve currency is a great luxury for the United States. Lots of people have complained about this. Charles de Gaulle complained about this incessantly. What does the future hold if the dollar ceases to be the world's prominent reserve currency? And first of all, is that likely to happen? And if that happens, what does that mean? Will we suddenly discover, as Marx would have warned us, that all of these ideas about freedom were just possible because the United States was wealthy, and as soon as the United States has to start paying its bills, suddenly we'll discover we weren't so serious about that freedom thing after all?
Yeah, the authoritarian mask will come off, and I think the dollar is likely to stay around for quite some time, because the advantage of a reserve currency is lots of different people use it. If reserve currency inherently has some value, so to get you need to get a different world currency that everyone found acceptable. Maybe the euro could be viable, but the other part of it is there has to be a lot of them out there. So in this sense, the big deficits, both trade and budgetary, that the United States runs perform something of a international social service by pumping dollars out into the system. We get iPhones and iPads and Mercedes, and we give people these things we call dollars, which we're very good at producing. In fact, we can produce unlimited amounts. And then they can use them amongst themselves, and the Germans can buy iPhones and whatever. Those dollars might never come back to the United States. So there's some inflationary pressure, but not much, because the South Africans will use it and everyone else. So that's an advantage of it. And you'd have to find another currency that people had a lot of, and a lot of spare ones. And the Europeans largely are running, roughly a trade balance. So generating lots of surplus euros for use is not really a going concern. The Chinese currency is not convertible, and in the rankings, it's ranked around, the international usage is roughly on par with that of the Mexican peso, to give you an idea of how much.
So that's usage outside of China itself. So
yes,
international usage.
Yes, outside of China. Right, correct. So that, and the other, it could have some usage within the region, but it's unlikely. And as long as China has major trade surpluses with a lot of other countries, they're more taking money than giving money, and the money they're taking is dollars. So I don't see that as really too much of a realistic prospect. And we've been through this once before. One of your earlier speakers had talked about the end of the dollar system, and it's sort of all-time favorite movies is Goldfinger, and this is when the dollar is still linked to gold, and they're talking about the Chinese, mind you, having an atomic device in Fort Knox that will irradiate gold and make it unusable, and Western financial markets will go into chaos because this gold is unusable. Well, when Nixon almost 50 years ago, this past August, went off gold for the US dollar, it was as if all the gold the United States held in Fort Knox had been irradiated. It's still stored away in vaults even today, unused. And the world economy, while it was fairly tumultuous, didn't have that sort of effect. In fact, it proved to be the dollar dethroned gold, not gold dethroning the dollar. So we've been through it once. The calamity was 50 years ago, and it was not so calamitous. Prices adjusted, and there was some inflation, but people came to be able to manage that. And the world economy has seen, if anything, a huge acceleration of growth in recent years.
It's fascinating to me. So basically, John Connolly was Goldfinger, right? Not some strange person.
That's right. John Connolly was Goldfinger.
Okay, I'm going to make a note of that. We'll have to have a whole discussion about that. But you raised a point that I'm going to confess that I had never thought about, right? You're never supposed to admit you don't know something, but I'm going to admit I don't know this. And I would submit, and I want to reinforce it for our audience because I'm curious how people feel about this, is often in discussions about the ultimate decline of the dollar, the argument is made: the United States was running up huge deficits. Other people are stronger. Therefore, the dollar is in danger of no longer being the world's reserve currency. You, however, have suggested that the production of all of these excess dollars actually reinforces the role of the dollar as reserve currency. And that ironically, the Chinese, by pursuing their mercantilist vision of running the biggest trade surpluses that they can, that they're essentially undermining the case for the Chinese currency as a world currency. Is there a reason why I haven't heard that from anybody else? And why do we still hear all these panicked things about the eventual decline of the dollar?
Well, I mean, there are things that could happen. Just as the United States shifted from being a net exporter to a net importer, you could imagine the Chinese might start doing things, buying farmland. And we saw this actually in the late 80s, when Japan bought Rockefeller Center, the heart of the trilateral movement, Sony Pictures, and a variety of other enterprises. So what happens if China starts buying up properties, farmland in Iowa? They might start building manufacturing facilities, as both the Japanese and Korea have. They could buy the New York Yankees. I'd be happy with that. But at what point, they start thinking, what if they start wanting to buy Boeing or Lockheed Martin or something like that? We obviously have arrangements in place to prevent certain foreign direct investment on national security grounds, but that's something one could do with surplus dollars. Because they're certainly good back here in the U.S., and that would be something that we, would want to be attentive to. But do keep in mind that, the Europeans, the Dutch, the British have been investing in the United States for hundreds of years. Their stock of, foreign direct investment in the United States vastly exceeds that of China or any other country. As does our investment in Europe. We've been doing it and accumulating it for decades and decades and decades, and that just doesn't disappear overnight. The British overseas investments that sort of disappeared during the Second World War were to fund a existential war over years and years and years, and the British ran down their international balance sheet to do it. I mean, for the good of mankind, I think, it wrecked the financial position of the British Empire. So as long as we don't get into some sort of very expensive world war where we're borrowing 200% of GDP and we stop producing goods ourselves other than war materials, that's quite a sustainable path, I think.
We'll make a note of that. Hopefully there people are paying attention to that, the geopoliticians out there. Well, and you mentioned earlier, right, the importance of the G7 as a way to sort of create this family of democratic capitalist nations. And it did include the Japanese. So it did broaden geographically, and I would broaden culturally, this image of, what is the capitalist world? What role can or should the G20 play in this? I mean, have we gotten, because the idea is you want to include more states in the discussions, but does the growth of the G20 make it less likely that the G20 is going to play any specific role because the members are just too distinct from each other?
Well, I think the G20 has, I think, come to the fore in part because of the erosion of the position of really the West European countries, that it could no longer serve as the executive committee of the world economy. A lot of other countries had economies that were now quite large and influential. And the rise of the developing world made it so that you needed, especially in the wake of the financial crisis where this comes in, that a lot of these countries had major balances and foreign reserves, and so if you were to pull through this and coordinate, you needed to get them on board. And a lot of them do not, or not a lot, but several of them do not share the same level of commitment to democracy the West does. The two big examples, of course, are Saudi Arabia and three, Russia and the People's Republic of China. The same token, you let in India, which is the world's largest democracy, and expand to other countries as well. Indonesia, that also has a democratic government. So these are, positive directions in many senses. If anything, it's a sort of expansion on the capitalist side rather than the democratic side. Although the G7, certainly in its founding, was a trifle iffy. Italy had never had a non-Christian democratic government, and Japan had never had a non-liberal democratic government. So they were democracies, but with a dominant party. And Germany, well, I mean, the Social Democrats are the most right-wing social democratic party in the world. So extent of their position. So you have that, but I think now we're looking much more at major democratic international market participants. But it's not necessarily the largest economies, and it's interesting what sort of countries, a handful that get excluded, and in Nigeria most prominently comes to mind. South Africa is the only African country, but Nigeria's economy is rather larger, and a sort of Central African member would be, a good, if you're really concerned about development, that would be a very good member to have. But I think the real concern is that Africa still remains frightfully poor, and this kept countries like Nigeria out, even though they have a larger economy than Argentina, who's in, for instance.
Right. Well, and so we've got a little less than 10 minutes to go, but Ira Strauss poses a question that I think helps us to circle back to the original ideas behind this seminar, and that is that if the Western and trilateral institutions and relationships didn't exist, would the U.S. situation vis-a-vis China and that of the other East Asians vis-a-vis China be worse? In other words, does it matter that the MetaWest exists, right? And would it be worth trying to upgrade it? When you say that it has this question of, do these institutions didn't exist, would things be worse? If they do exist and things are pretty good, is it worthwhile to try to tighten those ties vis-a-vis China? So in other words, built around the idea that China is not part of that community.
Well, I mean, the question, would we even have gotten to the position we're in if we didn't have these organizations? And I think the people who created the Bretton Woods institutions after the Second World War largely had it right. I think we'd have, their fear was you would have a relatively deinstitutionalized world, you'd have a reemergence of great power conflict, and so you needed these institutions. And I think that has been the unique feature of that post-war world. And in fact, I mean, it lays the groundwork for the United States' success and the West's success against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I don't think you could get to this point without those institutions having existed. Then you get the question of, well, having been successful in 1980, 1990, is this, couldn't you have gone your own way? Could you have said, these institutions, they serve their purpose, but now we're just gonna, go off, Germany will do its own thing, and so on. And I think the success of them led people to want to continue to invest in them. NATO would be one example that its purpose was gone, at least in the 90s, in terms of the Russian threat. But I think in terms of allied cooperation, if NATO hadn't existed, you would have to create it again as an organization for Western cooperation in the former Yugoslavia, Libya, elsewhere. So I think these, it's like the March of Dimes. They're not fighting polio anymore, but it was a very effective organization, and so it stays around even after its original mission is accomplished. Institutions have a way of doing that. That would be what I would think the answer to that would be.
Sure. But is it a matter of, are there things that can or should be done to revitalize or intensify these organizations, or should we, what would those kinds of things be?
Well, yeah, I think we see these as we try to deepen them, and sometimes we pull back. And what sort of makes me feel good that it's not just the United States is, you see with the things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S. pulls out of, but then the Japanese step up and take the lead and have a collaboration. So much so the People's Republic is now claiming they want to join. It might be rather too rules-based for them to sustain, but countries and organizations trying to create organizations for cooperation appears to be a way forward. I mean, the Asia Investment Bank that the Chinese created, I thought the U.S. in part missed a trick by not taking part in that. Even if it's an organization we wouldn't be a lead in, having an organization where we say we want other people to contribute to developing the region. Well, why not let the Chinese put their money in? And if we have a seat at the table, you get to observe it. I mean, the British and the French joined, so it's not as if it's just a Chinese-run group. So I think these international organizations, properly managed and orchestrated, work out quite well and beneficially. I think that's what, we have thousands and thousands of them now. They structure every facet of our lives, and we don't think about them for an instant. We think of the handful of big ones, but there are so many you never hear of that are just, making the world a much, much better place.
And I guess that's the goal, right? We would like to continue to make the world a better place. That is a nice and optimistic thought, which I think is a good place to end this conversation. Even though whether these organizations, whether these relationships continue to serve the purpose they've always served, how they will deal with challenges, right? Will the continued success of the democratic capitalist world encourage democracy in the rest of the world, or will capitalism eventually assert itself, I'd say, over democracy, right? That's not a new question, right? It's one we've been wrestling with for a while.
Yeah, so is it is what we're facing with the Chinese, or at least as we see it, with the Chinese, maybe the Russians, a sort of intra-capitalist civil war, sectarian civil war between the democratic element of capitalism and the authoritarian element of capitalism.
Well, and I guess if we'll see how that war goes, and how the competition works itself out, and if we want to talk about it some more, Mark, I promise we'll bring you back to discuss it further. But for today, we've reached about the end of our hour. Mark Duckenfield, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ron. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And FPRI thanks our sponsors and partners for their generous support for this program and all of our programs. If you have enjoyed this program today, we encourage you to bring a friend next time and tell a friend about FPRI, and to consider becoming a member or partner. Today's event is part of the Robert Strauss Who Pay Project, and we encourage you to consider what you would like to do to help us to continue events like this in the future. Today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will be here to discuss it at FPRI. If you have enjoyed this and you want to know more about what's going on at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.